Welcome. Find a comfortable position, let your body settle, and allow your breathing to slow. Tonight, we are going to take a long and gentle journey through one of the greatest civilizations the world has ever known, the Roman Empire. Over the next 100 facts, woven together into a single, quiet story, we will walk the streets of ancient Rome, sail its seas, listen to its poets, and follow the slow, extraordinary arc of a civilization that began with a city on 7 hills and ended up shaping almost everything about the world we live in today. There is nothing you need to do, and nowhere you need to be. Just rest, and listen, and let Rome come to you. This is where our story begins. Fact 1. According to Roman tradition, the city of Rome was founded on the 21st of April, in the year 753 BC, a date so precise the Romans celebrated it as a public holiday every year, calling it the Palilia. Fact 1. The city, they said, was founded by a man named Romulus, who gave the city his name. Romulus and his twin brother Remus had been raised, so the legend goes, by a she-wolf on the banks of that very river. Fact 2. Rome, in those earliest days, was not an empire at all. It was a kingdom. 7 kings ruled Rome one after another, some wise, some cruel, over a span of nearly 2.5 centuries. Fact 3. And it was under these early kings that Rome first began to take shape. The first roads were laid, the first temples rose from the hilltops, and the first sense of what it meant to be Roman quietly took root. But power, as it so often does, grew uncomfortable to share. In 509 BC, the Romans overthrew their last king, a man remembered by history as Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, and declared that no single man would ever rule Rome again. Fact 4. In his place, they created something remarkable, a republic. 2 elected leaders, called consuls, would share power equally, each able to veto the other. It was a system built, quite deliberately, on the fear of one person having too much control. Fact 5. The Roman Republic would last for nearly 5 centuries. 500 years of elections, debate, war, expansion, and slow, quiet transformation. And Rome was always growing. Gently, steadily, like a river widening as it moves toward the sea. By the 3rd century BC, Rome had extended its reach across most of the Italian peninsula. But it was the wars with Carthage, a great and powerful city on the northern coast of Africa, that truly tested the Roman spirit. These were called the Punic Wars, and they stretched across more than a century of intermittent conflict. Fact 6. The most dramatic of these came when a Carthaginian general named Hannibal marched an army, and, famously, a number of war elephants, across the Alps in the dead of winter to attack Rome from the north. Fact 7. The Romans were stunned. They lost battle after battle. And yet, they did not surrender. They absorbed each loss, reorganized, and kept going. That resilience, that deep, stubborn unwillingness to yield, would come to define Rome in the centuries that followed. Hannibal never took the city. Breathe slowly. Let the story settle around you like a warm room at the end of a long day. Rome, you see, was not built in a day, as the Romans themselves were fond of saying. It was built in moments of patience. In the long, unglamorous work of construction and law and agriculture. The Roman calendar, for instance, was carefully organized around the farming year, with festivals marking planting seasons and harvests, a reminder that beneath all the marble and military glory, Rome was, at its heart, a civilization of the earth. Fact 8. And the earth here is soft and dark and full of life. The city on those 7 hills is quiet now. The Tiber moves past in the evening light. In the hills above, fires are being lit for the night. Somewhere, a child is being told a story about Romulus and Remus and a she-wolf by the water's edge. Rome is very young still. It does not yet know what it will become. But it is already, in its bones, something extraordinary. A place that takes its traditions seriously, that honors its ancestors, that builds to last. Even now, in these early centuries, Roman engineers were beginning to experiment with concrete, a material so durable that structures made from it would still be standing more than 2,000 years later. Fact 9. Some of those buildings still stand today. Close your eyes a little more. The fire crackles softly. The river runs on. Rome sleeps and dreams of what it will one day be. And so Rome slept, and Rome woke, and Rome grew. The republic that the Romans had so carefully constructed was, in many ways, a marvel of its time. Power was distributed, debated, and, at least in theory, shared. At the center of Roman political life stood the Senate, a body of several hundred men drawn from Rome's most distinguished families, who gathered in a great hall to deliberate on the affairs of the state. Fact 10. The Senate did not pass laws directly, but its influence was immense. It controlled finances, directed foreign policy, and carried the weight of Roman tradition in every decision it made. To be a senator was to be, in the eyes of Rome, among the most respected men in the world. But Rome was never just its senators. Beneath the grand columns and polished marble of the Forum, the great open heart of the city where Romans gathered to conduct business, hear speeches, and simply be among one another, there lived a vast and bustling population of ordinary people. Shopkeepers and bakers, soldiers and slaves, farmers and philosophers. And these people had a voice too. In 494 BC, the common citizens of Rome, known as the plebeians, staged what historians call the first general strike in recorded history. They simply walked out of the city and refused to return until their rights were recognized. Fact 11. It worked. Slowly, over generations, the plebeians won the right to their own representatives, the tribunes, who could veto any law that harmed the common people. Fact 12. Rome was, in its own imperfect way, learning to listen. Let the thought drift through you like a slow current. There is no hurry here. Rome has centuries ahead of it yet. The streets of the city, even in these early Republican days, were beginning to take on a character all their own. Rome was famously loud. Roman writers complained about it constantly. The clatter of cartwheels on stone pavement, the calls of street vendors, the hammering of craftsmen at work. And so, at some point, the city introduced one of history's earliest traffic regulations. Carts and wagons were banned from the city streets during daylight hours to ease the congestion. Fact 13. This meant, of course, that all deliveries had to happen at night, which only made the noise worse after dark, much to the frustration of those trying to sleep. Some things, it seems, have not changed very much at all. Rome expanded, quietly and persistently, in every direction. By the 2nd century BC, Roman legions had marched into Greece, into Spain, into the eastern shores of the Mediterranean. And wherever Rome went, it brought something rather unusual for a conquering power. It often adopted the cultures it encountered, rather than simply erasing them. The Romans absorbed Greek philosophy, Greek art, Greek architecture. They translated Greek literature into Latin and taught it in their schools. The Roman gods were quietly merged with the Greek ones. Jupiter became Zeus, Mars became Ars, Venus became Aphrodite, until the two mythologies were nearly indistinguishable. Fact 14. Rome was vast enough, and confident enough, to be changed by the world it was changing. Breathe in. The evening is deepening now. All of this expansion, however, came at a cost. The wealth flooding into Rome from conquered territories made the rich extraordinarily powerful, and the poor increasingly desperate. Great landowners bought up the Italian countryside with their war profits, displacing the small farmers who had formed the backbone of Roman society for generations. Two brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, attempted to reform the land laws in the late 2nd century BC to redistribute some of that wealth more fairly. Fact 15. Both were killed for their efforts. Their deaths were an early warning, a quiet tremor before the earthquake, that the Republic was beginning to strain under its own contradictions. The age of the great generals was approaching. Men like Gaius Marius, who overhauled the entire Roman army in the late 2nd century BC, opening military service to landless citizens and creating a professional fighting force loyal not to Rome itself, but to its commander. Fact 16. It was a change that would have enormous consequences, consequences that Marius himself perhaps did not fully foresee. When soldiers owed their loyalty to a general rather than the state itself became vulnerable. And then came Sulla, and then Caesar, and the Republic began its long, slow unraveling. But we are not there yet. Rest for a moment in the hush before the storm. There is something worth lingering on here, the sheer, extraordinary ambition of Roman engineering during these centuries. The Romans were building roads. Not rough tracks through the mud, but straight, precisely leveled, beautifully surfaced roads that cut through forests and mountains and marshes with a kind of magnificent stubbornness. At the height of the empire, the Roman road network stretched for over 250,000 miles, enough to circle the earth more than 10 times. Fact 17. The roads were built in layers, a foundation of large stones, then gravel, then a smooth surface on top, and they were cambered slightly in the middle so that rainwater would drain off to the sides. Fact 18. Many of them are still visible today. Some are still in use. The Romans built things as though they expected them to last forever. And outside, on those roads, the legions march. Row upon row of soldiers, in perfect formation, their armor catching the afternoon sun. Each soldier carries not only his weapons but his own rations, his own tools, his own stake for making camp each night, up to 45 kilograms of equipment in total. They called these soldiers Marius's mules, a nickname earned with weary affection. Fact 19. They walk in silence mostly. The road stretches ahead of them, straight as an arrow, into the distance. Rome is somewhere behind them. Rome is also, in a sense, wherever they go. The light is fading now. The legions make camp for the night, a perfect rectangle of tents and ditches, built to the same design every single evening, in every corner of the known world, so that a soldier waking in a strange land could always find his way around in the dark. Fact 20. There is something deeply comforting in that. A small piece of home, carried everywhere. The fires are lit. The camp is quiet. And Rome, for another night, holds the world steady. The fires in the camp burn low through the night, and the sentries walk their slow circles in the dark, and somewhere far away, in the city on the 7 hills, something is shifting. The Republic is changing. You can feel it in the air, the way you can feel a change in weather before the clouds arrive, a certain stillness, a certain tension in things that were once settled. By the 1st century BC, Rome was the most powerful state in the known world. And yet inside that power, a deep restlessness had taken hold. The old system, 2 consuls, the Senate, the careful balance of competing interests, was struggling to contain the ambitions of the men it had created. Generals who had conquered nations. Men who had stood at the edges of the world and watched new horizons open before them. One of those men was Gaius Julius Caesar. Caesar was born in the year 100 BC, into a patrician family of modest means but ancient and distinguished lineage. The Julii claimed descent, no less, from the goddess Venus herself. Fact 21. He was, by most accounts, a man of extraordinary charm and energy, with a mind that moved quickly and a will that rarely bent. He was also, quietly, one of the most ambitious men Rome had ever produced. He simply had the gift of not appearing so. In 60 BC, Caesar formed a private political alliance with 2 of Rome's other most powerful men, the general Pompey and the enormously wealthy Crassus. Historians would later call this the First Triumvirate, though the Romans themselves had no such name for it at the time. Fact 22. It was not a formal institution but rather a gentleman's agreement, a quiet arrangement of mutual convenience between 3 men who each had something the others needed. It worked, for a while. Let your breathing slow. There is no rush to what comes next. Caesar used his new political influence to secure command of the Roman armies in Gaul, the vast territory that today we call France and Belgium and parts of Switzerland and Germany. And there, over 8 years of campaigning, he waged a series of wars that would bring the whole of Gaul under Roman control. Fact 23. He wrote about those campaigns himself, in clean, precise, almost hypnotic Latin, dispatches from the front that were read aloud in Rome to a rapt public, making Caesar famous in a way that no amount of political maneuvering could have achieved. He was a writer as well as a soldier, a storyteller as well as a conqueror. In Rome, that combination was almost irresistible. During those Gallic campaigns, Caesar also made 2 brief expeditions across the sea to the island of Britain, becoming the first Roman general ever to set foot on British soil in 55 BC. Fact 24. The expeditions were not entirely successful. The tides and storms of the British Channel were unlike anything his fleet had encountered in the calmer Mediterranean, but they added enormously to his legend. He had gone to the very edge of the known world and looked out beyond it. The thought settles softly. The edge of the world. And beyond it, only ocean. Back in Rome, the alliance was fracturing. Crassus had died on campaign in the east. Pompey and Caesar had grown wary of one another, their old friendship curdling slowly into rivalry. The Senate, alarmed by Caesar's power and popularity, ordered him to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. Caesar refused. In January of 49 BC, he led his army to the banks of a small river in northern Italy, the Rubicon, which marked the legal boundary between his military province and Roman territory. To cross it with an army was, under Roman law, an act of treason. He paused there, by all accounts, for some time. And then he crossed. Fact 25. The phrase has echoed through history ever since. To cross the Rubicon. To take the step from which there is no return. What he said, as he crossed, was this: the die is cast. Civil war followed. But it was brief and decisive. Within 4 years, Caesar had defeated his rivals and stood at the undisputed center of Roman power. The Senate, somewhat desperately, began heaping honors upon him, dictator, then dictator for 10 years, then, in early 44 BC, dictator perpetuo. Dictator in perpetuity. For life. Fact 26. It was, for those who had grown up believing in the Republic, a deeply troubling title. Rest now in the quiet of the evening. The city is lit with torches. The forum is still. The conspirators met in secret, in small groups, in private homes, in hushed conversations that stopped whenever a stranger passed. There were perhaps 60 of them in the end, senators, mostly, who believed that Caesar had gone too far. That one man, however brilliant, could not be allowed to become a king. Rome had expelled its kings 5 centuries before, and the memory of that expulsion was still sacred. Fact 27. On the Ides of March, the 15th of March, 44 BC, Julius Caesar was stabbed 23 times on the floor of the Senate. Fact 28. The assassins had expected, perhaps, that the Republic would simply resume, that removing Caesar would restore the old order like pulling a stone from a stream and watching the water close over it. It did not work that way. What followed instead was another civil war. Then another. The Republic, it turned out, had been held together not by its institutions but by the habits and assumptions of generations, and those habits were gone now, broken beyond repair. The assassins had killed Caesar. They had not killed the idea of Caesar. Into the chaos stepped a young man of 19, Caesar's great-nephew and adopted son, Gaius Octavius. History would know him as Augustus. Fact 29. He did not look like a conqueror. He was slight, often unwell, careful in his movements and his words. He had none of his great-uncle's physical charisma, none of the soldier's easy authority. What he had instead was patience and intelligence, and a quality rarer than either, an instinct for knowing exactly how much power to show and how much to conceal. Over the next 13 years, he fought and negotiated and outmaneuvered his way to sole control of Rome. And then, in 27 BC, he stood before the Senate and offered, with great ceremony, to give it all back. The Senate refused, of course. They gave him titles instead. They called him Augustus, the revered one. They called him Princeps, the first citizen. Fact 30. Not king. Never king. But first among equals, in a Rome that had been so thoroughly reorganized around his person that the distinction had ceased to matter in any practical sense. The Republic had become an empire. And almost no one had seen it happen. The torches burn low in the Forum. The senators make their way home through the lamplit streets. The Tiber runs on, dark and quiet, carrying the city's reflection on its surface. Augustus walks in his garden as the night deepens. He is building something, slowly and carefully. Something he intends to last. The stars above Rome are very bright tonight. Augustus walks in his garden, and Rome settles around him like a city learning, slowly, to exhale. For the first time in nearly a century, there is no civil war. No rival generals marching on the capital. No emergency decrees, no panicked Senate sessions, no armies massing on the horizon. There is simply peace. A long, extraordinary, almost disbelieving peace that would stretch across the Mediterranean world for more than 200 years. The Romans called it the Pax Romana. The Roman peace. Fact 31. It is worth sitting with that for a moment. 200 years of relative stability across an empire that stretched from the deserts of North Africa to the forests of Scotland, from the Atlantic coast of Portugal to the banks of the Euphrates in what is now Iraq. Fact 32. Tens of millions of people, speaking dozens of languages, practicing dozens of religions, living under a single system of law and administration. It was not a perfect peace. There were wars at the borders, rebellions in the provinces, cruelties great and small. But compared to what had come before, and to almost everything that would come after, it was remarkable. Augustus understood that peace needed to be built as well as won. He rebuilt Rome physically, famously boasting that he had found a city of brick and left it a city of marble. Fact 33. Temples, basilicas, a new forum bearing his name, the Great Altar of Peace, the Ara Pacis, commissioned to celebrate the end of civil war. He reformed the city's administration, created a permanent fire brigade, improved the grain supply, reorganized the army. He was, in the language of a later age, an extraordinarily effective administrator. He was also, quietly, a master of image. Let your eyes grow heavy. The marble is cool and white in the afternoon sun. Augustus lived with deliberate simplicity, or at least, the appearance of it. His house on the Palatine Hill was modest by the standards of wealthy Romans, furnished plainly, its floors tiled without ostentation. He wore clothes woven by his wife and daughters. He ate simple food, coarse bread, small fishes, hard cheese. Fact 34. Whether this was genuine frugality or careful political theater is a question historians have debated ever since. Perhaps, as with most things about Augustus, it was both at once. He ruled for 41 years. When he died, in AD 14, at the age of 75, the empire he left behind was so thoroughly shaped by his hand that the Romans simply continued in the grooves he had made, as a river continues in the channel cut for it long after the flood has passed. His last words, by some accounts, were these: "Have I played the part well?" The question drifts upward, into the warm Italian air, and dissolves. After Augustus came a succession of emperors, each different, each leaving his own mark on the vast and complex organism of Rome. Some were capable administrators. Some were scholars. Some, by any reasonable measure, were deeply troubled men who should never have been anywhere near absolute power. Tiberius, who succeeded Augustus, was capable but deeply suspicious, retreating in his later years to the island of Capri and governing the empire by letter, rarely returning to Rome. Fact 35. Then came Caligula, who reigned for just under 4 years and whose behavior became so erratic, so extravagant and cruel and bizarre, that the Senate began to wonder, in hushed tones, whether he had lost his mind entirely. He reportedly made his favorite horse a consul of Rome, though whether this was madness or a pointed insult to the Senate remains a matter of debate. Fact 36. Then came Claudius, who was considered a fool by his own family, overlooked and underestimated his entire life, only to find himself emperor by accident, discovered hiding behind a curtain by the Praetorian Guard after Caligula's assassination, and proclaimed emperor on the spot. Fact 37. He turned out to be one of the more competent rulers of the first century, a genuine scholar who wrote histories of the Etruscans and the Carthaginians, and who oversaw the successful Roman invasion of Britain in AD 43. Fact 38. There is something quietly satisfying in that. The man everyone dismissed, governing an empire. Breathe slowly. The evening light is long and golden over the hills. It was under the emperors of the 1st and 2nd centuries that Roman city life reached its fullest and most extraordinary expression. At its peak, the city of Rome may have had a population of 1 million people, making it by far the largest city in the Western world, a scale not seen again in Europe until London in the 19th century. Fact 39. 1 million people, packed onto those 7 hills and the valleys between them, living in towering apartment blocks called insulae, some of them 6 or 7 stories high. Fact 40. The ground floors of these buildings were occupied by shops and wealthy tenants. The higher you lived, the poorer you were, and the further you had to carry your water up the stairs. There was no running water above the ground floor. There was, in most cases, no heating either. Roman winters could be bitterly cold, and the poor huddled together for warmth in their high, drafty rooms while the wealthy below them enjoyed the luxury of underfloor heating, the hypercore system, in which hot air was channeled through hollow spaces beneath the floor. Fact 41. The Romans knew how to be comfortable when they could afford it. And when the day's work was done, Romans of all classes sought their comfort in the same place, the baths. The great public bathhouses of Rome were extraordinary institutions, unlike anything else in the ancient world. They were free, or nearly free, to enter. They offered not just hot and cold pools but libraries, gardens, exercise yards, barber shops, snack cellars. Fact 42. People spent hours there, soaking, socializing, doing business, exchanging gossip. The baths were, in a sense, the living room of Rome, the place where the city's enormous, fractious, endlessly varied population came together and simply existed alongside one another. The water is warm. The steam rises slowly. The noise of the city is muffled here, softened to a distant hum. Outside, the aqueducts bring water to the city in an endless silver stream, 11 great aqueducts by the height of the empire, carrying hundreds of millions of liters of clean, fresh water every single day from springs in the hills around Rome, flowing by gravity alone, across valleys and through mountains, into the fountains and bathhouses and kitchens of 1 million people. Fact 43. It is one of the great engineering achievements of the ancient world. And most Romans simply took it for granted, the way we take for granted the water that comes when we turn a tap. The aqueduct runs on through the quiet countryside. The water moves steadily in the dark. Somewhere in the city, a fountain plays in an empty square, and the sound of it is cool and clean and unending. Rome sleeps. The empire breathes. And the water keeps flowing, long into the night. The fountain plays on in the empty square, and the city breathes around it, and somewhere above the rooftops the stars are very clear and still. We have been in Rome for a while now. Let us walk through it together, slowly, the way you might wander through a city on a quiet morning before the crowds arrive. Let us see what life here actually looked like, not the emperors and the armies and the grand sweep of history, but the small, ordinary, human texture of a day in the greatest city the ancient world had ever known. The morning begins early in Rome. Before sunrise, the streets fill with the sounds of the city coming back to life. The carts that have been rumbling through the darkness begin to clear away, and the first shopkeepers roll up their shutters and set out their wares. The smell of fresh bread drifts from the bakeries, warm and yeasty in the cool morning air. Romans, for the most part, did not cook at home. The fire risk in those tall, wooden-framed insulae was simply too great, and indeed, fires were a constant and terrifying feature of Roman urban life, sweeping through neighborhoods with devastating speed. Fact 44. And so the city was filled with thermopolia, essentially ancient fast food counters, built into the fronts of buildings, with large ceramic jars sunk into stone counters to keep food warm. Fact 45. You could buy hot stew, roasted meat, wine, olives, bread, a whole meal, standing at the counter, for a few small coins. Archaeologists excavating Pompeii have found dozens of them preserved in extraordinary detail, the food jars still in their counters, the painted menus still visible on the walls. The thought settles gently. A fast food counter, 2,000 years ago. The stew is warm. The wine is rough and red. Romans ate 3 times a day, though the morning meal, the ientaculum, was little more than a piece of bread dipped in olive oil, perhaps with a few olives or a bit of cheese. Fact 46. The main meal of the day came in the late afternoon, the cena, which for wealthier Romans could stretch for hours, course after course, reclining on cushioned couches arranged around a low central table. The Romans ate lying down, propped on their left elbows, reaching across to the dishes with their right hands. Fact 47. There is something wonderfully relaxed in that image. No one is in a hurry. The afternoon light slants through the open windows. Someone is playing a lyre in the next room. Let your own body settle now, heavy and unhurried. The food at a wealthy Roman table could be extraordinary, and sometimes extraordinarily strange by our standards. Dormice fattened on walnuts and served with honey. Flamingo boiled with dates and vinegar. Peacock eggs. Sea urchins. Roasted parrot. Fact 48. The Romans prized the unusual and the exotic, importing foods from the furthest corners of their empire, pepper and ginger from India, dates from North Africa, silphium from Cyrene, a flavoring so valued and so overharvested that it was eaten into extinction. Fact 49. The most prized condiment of all, however, was something rather less glamorous, a fermented fish sauce called garum, made by layering fish and salt in large clay vessels and leaving them in the sun to liquefy over several months. Fact 50. It sounds, by any modern reckoning, quite appalling. And yet the Romans put it on almost everything, the way we might use salt, or soy sauce, or Worcestershire sauce. They exported it across the empire in distinctive amphora jars. They had grades and vintages of it, the way we have grades of olive oil. The very best garum was extraordinarily expensive. We are halfway through our journey now. 100 facts, and we have reached the 50th. Let that settle softly, like a blanket drawn up against the evening chill. 50 facts. And Rome is still here. Still cooking and eating and building and arguing and dreaming. Step outside again into the afternoon streets. The Forum is busy, it is always busy, with advocates making speeches, money changers at their tables, philosophers holding impromptu lectures to small clusters of listeners. Rome was a deeply litigious society, and the law courts were among the most theatrical venues in the city. Fact 51. Roman advocates were orators first and lawyers second, and the great courtroom speeches of men like Cicero were attended as public entertainment, copied out and circulated, read and reread for the beauty of their language as much as the sharpness of their argument. Cicero himself, the greatest orator Rome ever produced, by the common consensus of his own time and of the centuries that followed, wrote that he had never once entered a courtroom without feeling nervous beforehand. Fact 52. That small confession, crossing 2,000 years, feels oddly close. The most accomplished speaker in the ancient world, his heart beating fast before he rose to speak. We are not so different, after all. The shadows are lengthening now. The afternoon crowd in the Forum begins to thin. And across the city, another kind of entertainment is drawing people away, toward the Circus Maximus, the great chariot racing track that sat in the valley between the Palatine and Aventine hills. The Circus Maximus was the largest stadium ever built in the ancient world, or, some would argue, in any world up to that point. At its fullest capacity, it could hold somewhere between 150,000 and 250,000 spectators. Fact 53. Try to hold that number in your mind for a moment. 250,000 people, gathered in one place, watching horses run. The noise must have been extraordinary, not just loud but physical, a vibration you would have felt in your chest, in your bones. Chariot racing was Rome's great popular obsession. There were 4 teams, the Blues, the Greens, the Reds, and the Whites, and the rivalry between their supporters was intense enough to occasionally spill into violence. Fact 54. Successful charioteers were the celebrities of their age, recognized in the street, celebrated in graffiti scratched onto city walls, their names known across the empire. A charioteer named Gaius Appuleius Diocles reportedly won 1,462 races across a career spanning 24 years, accumulating prize money equivalent, by some calculations, to several $billion in modern terms. Fact 55. The chariots thunder around the track. The crowd rises as one. The dust hangs in the golden afternoon air. And then, slowly, the noise fades. The race is over. The crowd begins to move homeward through the cooling streets, talking and laughing, the excitement of the afternoon still warm in their chests. Night is coming to Rome. The shopkeepers are pulling down their shutters. The torches are being lit at the corners of the larger streets, though most of the alleyways will be dark. Romans who went out after dark carried their own lamps, small clay things cupped in the palm, casting a little pool of wavering orange light. Fact 56. The wealthy had slaves to carry torches ahead of them and clear the way. Everyone else picked their path carefully through the dark, stepping around the hazards of a city that had no saws in its upper streets, hoping not to encounter the more dangerous characters that emerged at night. Rome after dark was a different city. Louder in some ways, the carts were back, and in other ways very quiet, the buildings dark above the first floor, the alleyways empty. But in the apartments, behind the shuttered windows, there is firelight. There is the smell of cooking. There are voices, low and ordinary, a mother talking to her children, an old man coughing, somewhere the sound of someone singing quietly to themselves. A city of 1 million people, settling into the night. The lamp burns low. The song fades. Rome is resting now. The lamp burns low, and Rome rests, and we rest with it for a moment. We have walked the streets and visited the baths and heard the roar of the Circus Maximus. We have eaten bread at a street counter and watched the chariots thunder past in clouds of golden dust. We know this city now, a little. We have begun to feel its rhythms, the early mornings and the long afternoons, the noise and the quiet, the grandeur and the ordinariness sitting side by side on the same narrow street. But Rome was always more than its capital city. The empire was a vast and intricate thing, stretching across 3 continents, containing within it an almost unimaginable variety of peoples and places and ways of living. To understand Rome fully, we have to leave the city for a while. We have to follow those long straight roads out into the provinces, into the hills of Spain and the plains of North Africa and the green, rainy island at the edge of the world. Let the city fall away behind you. The road stretches ahead, straight and pale in the early morning light. The Roman Empire at its greatest extent, under the Emperor Trajan in AD 117, covered approximately 5 million square kilometers. Fact 57. To govern something of that size, before telegraphs, before railways, before any form of communication faster than a galloping horse, required a bureaucratic and administrative system of extraordinary sophistication. Messages sent from Rome to the furthest corners of the empire could take weeks, sometimes months, to arrive. Decisions made in a marble office on the Palatine Hill might not be implemented on the ground until an entirely different season had turned. Fact 58. And yet it functioned. Not perfectly, nothing that large and complex ever does, but with a resilience and consistency that astonished even the Romans themselves. Part of what made it work was the law. Roman law was, in many respects, the empire's most enduring gift to the world, more lasting even than the roads or the aqueducts or the architecture. It was a system built on written codes, on precedent, on the principle that even the most powerful were bound by rules they had not written themselves. Fact 59. The great legal codes developed under the Roman Empire would form the foundation of legal systems across Europe and beyond. In France, in Spain, in Italy, in Latin America, systems still in use, in one form or another, today. The idea that law applies to everyone. That justice should be consistent and predictable. That a person is innocent until proven guilty. These ideas were not invented by Rome, but Rome gave them form, and wrote them down, and carried them to the edges of the world. Fact 60. Let that drift through you quietly. The idea of a rule that applies to everyone. How extraordinary, and how fragile, such an idea is. Now let the road carry us north. Out of the warmth of Italy, through the Alpine passes where the air grows sharp and cold, down into the broad river valleys of Gaul. The landscape is different here, wilder, greener, the forests deeper and darker than anything in the Mediterranean south. But look, and you will see the signs of Rome everywhere. The straight road underfoot. The milestone, carved with the distance to the nearest town. And ahead, rising from the surrounding countryside, the walls of a Roman city. Roman cities were built to a remarkably consistent pattern. A grid of streets, a central forum, a basilica for legal and administrative business, public baths, a theatre or amphitheatre, temples to the imperial gods. Fact 61. Whether you were in Roman London or Roman Cologne or Roman Carthage, you would have found yourself in a place organized along familiar lines, speaking a language you knew, using a currency you recognized, subject to laws you understood. It was, in its way, a kind of globalization, the first the Western world had ever seen. And at the center of each of those cities, the forum hummed with activity. Commerce and politics and religion and law, all conducting their business within a few hundred meters of one another. The Romans did not separate these things the way we tend to. The merchant and the magistrate and the priest occupied the same public space, moved through the same colonnaded walkways, drank from the same fountains. Breathe in the morning air. The market stalls are setting up. The smell of spices, of leather, of fresh-cut timber. The economy that flowed through those cities and along those roads was staggeringly complex. Roman merchants traded not just within the empire but far beyond its borders, with India, with China, with sub-Saharan Africa. Roman coins have been found in excavations in India and Vietnam. Chinese silk found its way to Roman markets along the great overland routes that would later be called the Silk Road. Fact 62. A wealthy Roman woman in the 1st century AD might be wearing fabric that had been woven in China, dyed with pigment from India, sewn in Alexandria, and shipped to Rome via half a dozen intermediate ports. The world, in this sense, was already connected in ways we rarely appreciate. The goods moved along the roads, and along the rivers, and most of all along the sea. The Romans were not, by instinct, a seafaring people. They had come to naval power late and somewhat reluctantly, but at the height of the empire, the Mediterranean was so thoroughly controlled by Roman naval forces that they called it simply Mare Nostrum, our sea. Fact 63. Pirates, who had once made Mediterranean trade almost impossible, had been suppressed so effectively that merchant ships could sail without military escort, their holds full of wine and olive oil and grain and glass, crossing what had once been dangerous waters as calmly as a cart crossing a paved road. Our sea. The thought is immense and quiet. All that blue water, held in Roman hands. Now let us pause for a moment on the shore of that sea and think about something that tends to get lost in the grand narrative of Rome, the lives of those for whom the empire was not a system of law and order and opportunity, but of bondage. Slavery was fundamental to Roman society in a way that is important not to look away from. The Roman economy depended on enslaved labor at every level, in the fields, in the mines, in the homes of the wealthy, in the workshops and bakeries and building sites of the city. Fact 64. At the height of the empire, somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of the population of Italy may have been enslaved. Fact 65. These were people captured in Rome's wars, or born into slavery, or sold into it by poverty, people from every corner of the known world, speaking every language, of every background, stripped of their freedom and put to work in service of a civilization that celebrated liberty in its public speeches while denying it absolutely in its private arrangements. The contradiction was not lost on all Romans. Some philosophers, most notably the Stoics, argued that slaves were the moral equals of their masters, that the condition of slavery was an accident of fortune and not a reflection of a person's worth. Fact 66. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus, whose writings on resilience and freedom of mind remain widely read today, was himself a former slave. Fact 67. He had been born into slavery, had been beaten and injured by a cruel owner, and had gone on to become one of the most respected thinkers of his age. That his ideas about the freedom of the inner life came from a man who had known the complete absence of outer freedom gives them a weight and an honesty that is hard to match. The thought sits with you, heavy and important. We do not pass over it. We carry it with us, as part of the full picture of what Rome was. The shore of the sea is quiet now. The water moves in small, gentle waves against the sand. A merchant ship is being loaded in the harbor, amphora after amphora passed from hand to hand down a long human chain, stowed carefully in the hold for the crossing ahead. The sky above the harbor is very blue. The ropes creak. The sailors call to one another in a language that is almost Latin but not quite, the particular dialect of the sea, worn smooth by travel. The ship is ready. Rome spreads out behind the harbor, in every direction, as far as the eye can see and far beyond. Our sea. Our roads. Our law. And somewhere at the center of all of it, a lamp burning on a desk in a room on the Palatine Hill, and an emperor reading dispatches from the edges of a world he will never see in person, making decisions about places he knows only from maps. The lamp gutters slightly in a draught from the window. He reads on. The emperor reads on, and the lamp burns steadily, and outside the window the city of Rome is quiet in the small hours of the night. We have come a long way together. We have walked the streets and sailed the sea and stood on the shore and looked out across the full, complicated breadth of what Rome was. And now, in this 7th hour of our journey, let us turn our attention to something we have touched on only briefly, the inner life of Rome. Not the politics or the engineering or the commerce, but the things Romans believed, and felt, and feared, and hoped for. The texture of the spirit, as well as the stone. The Romans were, by nature and by tradition, a deeply religious people. Not religious in the way we might use that word today, not concerned, primarily, with personal salvation or with a direct and intimate relationship with a single God, but religious in a civic, communal, almost contractual sense. The gods were real, they were present, and they needed to be kept satisfied. Fact 68. Religion in Rome was less about faith and more about practice, the correct performance of rituals, the offering of sacrifices, the observance of sacred festivals, the reading of omens. Do these things correctly, at the right times and in the right ways, and the gods would look favorably on Rome. Neglect them, and disaster would follow. There were gods for everything. Gods of the harvest and the sea, gods of doorways and boundaries, gods of the hearth fire that burned in every Roman home. Every household had its own small shrine, the lararium, where the family's protective spirits, the lares, were honored with small offerings of food and incense each morning. Fact 69. A Roman family beginning their day would pause at this little shrine, make their offering, say their prayers, and then go about their business, a moment of quiet ritual before the noise of the day began. The thought is gentle and close. A family, in the early morning light. The smell of incense. A small flame. As Rome expanded and absorbed the cultures of Greece and Egypt and the Near East, its religious life expanded too, drawing in new gods and new cults from every direction. The mystery religions were particularly popular, secretive, initiation-based cults that promised their followers special knowledge and a blessed afterlife. Fact 70. The cult of Isis, the Egyptian goddess, spread widely across the Roman world. The cult of Mithras, a warrior god of Persian origin, worshipped in underground temples in rituals of slaughter and rebirth, was especially popular among Roman soldiers. Fact 71. Into this already crowded and varied religious landscape, in the 1st century AD, came a new faith. It began in a small Roman province on the eastern edge of the empire, Judea, with the execution, under the Roman prefect Pontius Pilate, of a Jewish preacher named Jesus of Nazareth. Fact 72. What followed, in the decades and centuries after that execution, was one of the most remarkable stories in human history, the slow, persistent, unstoppable spread of Christianity through the Roman world, carried by missionaries and merchants and soldiers and slaves, crossing borders and languages and social classes, moving from the margins of empire to its very center. For most of the first 3 centuries AD, Christians in Rome existed in a state of intermittent and sometimes brutal persecution. They were blamed for disasters, accused of disloyalty to the state, thrown to wild animals in the arena for public entertainment. Fact 73. And yet the faith kept growing. It spread through the empire's poorest communities first, among slaves and freedmen and women and the dispossessed, carried by the radical idea that every human soul had equal worth in the eyes of God, regardless of rank or wealth or legal status. Let that drift through you softly. The idea of equal worth. How quietly revolutionary it was. Then, in the year 312 AD, something extraordinary happened. The Emperor Constantine, on the eve of a crucial battle at the Milvian Bridge outside Rome, reportedly saw a vision, a cross of light in the sky, with the words in this sign, "Conquer." Fact 74. He ordered his soldiers to paint Christian symbols on their shields. He won the battle. And the following year, with the Edict of Milan, he issued an order granting religious tolerance throughout the empire, effectively ending the persecution of Christians and beginning the long process by which Christianity would become the official religion of Rome. Fact 75. The world turned, quietly, on that hinge. Breathe slowly. We are 3/4 of the way through our 100 facts now. The night is deep and still. Let us move, for a while, from the spirit to the mind. Because Rome produced, alongside its roads and its laws and its gods, an extraordinary culture of literature and thought that has never entirely left us. The poets came first to mind. Virgil, who spent 11 years writing the Aeneid, Rome's great national epic, the story of the Trojan hero Aeneas and his journey to found the city that would become Rome, and who died before he considered it finished, asking on his deathbed that it be destroyed. Fact 76. His friends ignored the request. The Aeneid survived, was immediately recognized as a masterpiece, and has been read continuously for more than 2,000 years. Then Ovid, whose Metamorphoses, a great, playful, endlessly inventive collection of transformation myths drawn from Greek and Roman tradition, was so subversive in its irreverence that the Emperor Augustus exiled him to a remote town on the Black Sea, where he spent the last decade of his life writing heartbroken letters begging to be allowed to come home. Fact 77. He never was. He died in exile, far from Rome, still writing. And Horace, who gave us the phrase carpe diem, seize the day, in a poem about the importance of enjoying the present moment rather than worrying too much about the future. Fact 78. The phrase has been repeated so many times, in so many contexts, that it has worn smooth with use. But in its original setting it is part of something quietly beautiful, an invitation to put down your anxieties, pour yourself a cup of wine, and simply be present in the warmth of the afternoon. Pour yourself a cup of wine. Be present in the warmth. There was Seneca, the Stoic philosopher and playwright who served as advisor to the Emperor Nero, writing essays on the shortness of life and the importance of using time well, even as the court around him descended into paranoia and violence. Fact 79. And Marcus Aurelius, emperor, soldier, and philosopher, who wrote his private meditations not for publication but simply as a way of reminding himself, day after day, how to be a better person. Those meditations, never intended for anyone else's eyes, are still in print today. Fact 80. Still in print. Still read. Still useful. The thought settles warmly. A man writing to himself, in a tent on a military campaign, 2,000 years ago. And you, reading his words, or hearing them carried through the long corridor of time. Rome is not only stone and road and empire. It is also this, the voice of a person trying to understand how to live, reaching forward through the centuries, finding you here, in the quiet of the night. The stars above Rome are the same stars above you now. The lamp on the emperor's desk has burned very low. He sets down his pen. He looks out of the window at the dark city below, at the torches moving slowly through the streets, at the great dark curve of the Tiber catching the last of the moonlight. He picks up his pen again. You have power over your mind, he writes, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. He sets the pen down once more. Outside, the city breathes. Marcus Aurelius sets down his pen, and the lamp gutters, and the night settles around the palace like a warm and heavy cloak. We are deep into our story now. 80 facts behind us, 20 still ahead. And the story, as all long stories must, is beginning to turn. We have lived for a while in the sunlit middle of Rome, in its confidence and its abundance, its poetry and its philosophy, its great roads running straight and true to the edges of the world. But nothing lasts forever. Not empires, not summers, not the particular quality of light on a late afternoon that makes you want to stay exactly where you are and never move. Rome knew this, in its bones. Its philosophers wrote about it constantly. Its poets circled it like a moth circles a flame. All things pass. The Tiber was here before Rome, and the Tiber would be here long after. But before we come to the ending, let us spend a little while longer in the world Rome made, because there are still corners of it we have not yet visited. There are still things worth knowing, worth holding gently in the mind before sleep takes them. Let us go, for a moment, to the arena. The Colosseum, or, as the Romans themselves called it, the Flavian Amphitheater, was begun under the Emperor Vespasian in AD 72 and completed 8 years later under his son Titus. Fact 81. It was built on the site of an artificial lake that had formed part of the private pleasure gardens of Nero, a deliberately symbolic choice, a statement that what had been taken from the people by a tyrant was being given back. It could hold between 50 and 80,000 spectators, arranged across 4 tiers of seating that were carefully allocated by social class. Senators at the front, ordinary citizens above, women and the poor at the very top. Fact 82. The engineering was extraordinary. The Colosseum had 80 entrances, numbered so that spectators could find their seats quickly, and was designed so that the entire crowd of 80,000 people could be emptied in under 15 minutes. Fact 83. Beneath the arena floor, invisible to the crowd, ran a complex network of tunnels and chambers, the Hypogeum, where gladiators waited, where animals were caged, where elaborate stage machinery could be used to raise men and beasts suddenly through trapdoors into the blinking light of the arena above. Fact 84. The thought floats upward, through those trapdoors, into the roar and the light. The gladiators themselves are perhaps the most vivid and most misunderstood figures of the Roman world. They were, in the popular imagination, helpless slaves forced into the arena against their will, and many were indeed enslaved, or condemned criminals, or prisoners of war. But a significant number were volunteers. Free men who chose the gladiatorial life for its prize money, its food and training and lodging, and, perhaps most strangely, its fame. Fact 85. Successful gladiators were the most celebrated athletes of their world. Their faces appeared on lamps and cups and children's toys. Women wrote their names on the walls of buildings. They were cheered and adored in a way that a modern footballer or film star might recognize. And the fights themselves were not, as is sometimes imagined, simply slaughter. They were skilled, technical, carefully regulated contests between trained professionals. Referees stopped bouts that became too one-sided. A defeated gladiator could appeal to the crowd for mercy, and the crowd, and the presiding magistrate, often granted it. Fact 86. Killing a gladiator was expensive, after all. They took years to train. Death in the arena was real and not uncommon, but it was not the inevitable outcome of every fight. The crowd settles. The sand is raked clean between bouts. A vendor moves through the tiers selling wine and small pastries. Let your breathing slow with the rhythm of it. Now let us leave the arena and walk a little further, further in time, and further to the edges of what Rome could hold together. By the 3rd century AD, the empire was beginning to strain. Not suddenly, not dramatically, Rome never did anything dramatically if it could help it, but slowly and in many places at once, like a vast net developing tears in its fabric, here and there and here again, faster than they could be repaired. The 3rd century is sometimes called the crisis of the 3rd century, a period of roughly 50 years, from 235 to 284 AD, during which the empire was convulsed by military anarchy. In those 5 decades, Rome had no fewer than 50 different emperors. Fact 87. 50. Some ruled for years, some for months, some for days. Most died violently, murdered by rivals, killed in battle, assassinated by their own soldiers. The average reign lasted less than 2 years. The empire splintered, briefly, into 3 separate competing states. Plagues swept through the population. The frontiers, for the first time, began to bend. The thought is soft and melancholy. 50 emperors. 50 men standing briefly at the center of the world. It is worth pausing here to think about what was happening at those frontiers, because the peoples pressing against them were not simply barbarian hordes in the old dismissive sense, but complex, organized societies with their own cultures and histories and ambitions. The Goths, the Franks, the Alemanni, the Vandals, these were not random raiders but confederacies of tribes that had been living alongside the Roman world for generations, trading with it, serving in its armies, absorbing its culture, and slowly growing strong enough to challenge it. Fact 88. Many of Rome's later soldiers were, in fact, Germanic, men from the very peoples the empire was supposedly defending against, recruited because the pool of Roman-born soldiers was shrinking and the need for fighters was not. Fact 89. The line between Roman and barbarian, which had once seemed so clear and so important, was blurring, had been blurring, gradually, for a very long time. The empire recovered, somewhat, under a series of strong soldier emperors in the late 3rd century. But the recovery required changes that themselves changed what Rome was. The Emperor Diocletian, coming to power in 284 AD, reorganized the empire so thoroughly that historians sometimes speak of a before and after. He doubled the size of the army. He restructured the tax system. He divided the empire into eastern and western halves, each with its own emperor and junior co-emperor, a system called the Tetrarchy, the rule of 4. Fact 90. It was a practical solution to the problem of governing something too large for one person to manage. It was also, quietly, an acknowledgement that the single unified Roman Empire of Augustus was becoming something different. Something was ending. Something else was beginning, in the long uncertain space between them. Breathe slowly. The night is deep and wide. The Emperor Constantine, whom we met earlier standing before his vision of the cross, was himself a product of this divided, transitional world. He reunited the empire under his sole rule in 324 AD, and made another decision that would echo through the centuries: he moved the capital. Fact 91. Not Rome, but a new city, built from scratch on the site of the old Greek town of Byzantium, on the narrow strait where Europe and Asia face each other across a strip of dark water. He called it Constantinople, the city of Constantine, and filled it with treasures and statues and scholars drawn from across the empire. Rome was still Rome. But the center of gravity had shifted, eastward, across the sea. The new city rose quickly, white and gleaming, above the water. Its harbors filled with ships. Its markets filled with goods. Its churches, for this was already a Christian empire now, rose above the rooftops, their crosses catching the morning light. Constantinople looked out across the strait toward Asia, and Asia looked back. And somewhere behind it, in the west, the old city on the 7 hills continued its long, slow, magnificent, melancholy transformation into something the world had never quite seen before, a city that was becoming a memory of itself, even as it still lived and breathed and argued and prayed. The Tiber runs on through the dark. The stars are very still. Constantinople gleams above the water, new and white and full of possibility, and behind it, across the long miles of road and sea, Rome dreams its ancient dreams on its 7 hills. We are close to the end of our story now. Not the end of Rome. Rome never really ends, not entirely. It simply transforms and disperses and flows into everything that comes after it, the way a river flows into the sea and becomes the sea. But we are close to the end of the particular Rome we have been traveling through, the Rome of the legions and the Senate, the aqueducts and the arena, the poets and the philosophers and the long Pax Romana afternoons. Let the remaining miles pass slowly beneath your feet. There is no hurry. The road is straight and smooth and the evening light is kind. After Constantine, the empire continued, but continued in the way that very old and very large things continue, with a kind of magnificent, creaking persistence, adjusting and adapting and shedding parts of itself that could no longer be held. The western half grew weaker. The eastern half, centered on Constantinople, grew stronger. The two halves drifted, slowly, like continents separating along a fault line so gradual you could live an entire life without noticing the movement. In 380 AD, the Emperor Theodosius made Christianity not merely tolerated but mandatory, the official and exclusive religion of the Roman Empire, all other forms of worship formally prohibited. Fact 92. The old temples were closed. The ancient sacrifices ceased. The gods who had watched over Rome for 1,000 years, Jupiter on his throne, Mars with his spear, Janus at every doorway, were officially retired, their long tenure ended by imperial decree. It was a transformation so complete that it is almost impossible to fully imagine. A civilization that had organized its entire public and private life around one religious system for a millennium, shifting, within a generation, to something wholly different. The old priests set down their sacred implements for the last time. The temple fires went out. Something very ancient ended quietly, in the smoke. Breathe in. The air is cool and still. The Western Empire, meanwhile, was finding the weight of itself increasingly difficult to bear. The frontiers were long and the armies expensive and the tax base shrinking as plague and instability drove people from the land. Germanic groups were no longer simply pressing against the borders, they were settling inside them, in large organized groups, under their own leaders, subject to Roman law in theory but in practice governed by their own customs and loyalties. Fact 93. In 410 AD, something happened that sent a shockwave through the entire Roman world, something so unexpected, so apparently impossible, that the philosopher Jerome, hearing the news in Bethlehem, wrote that he was so stunned he could not speak. The city of Rome was sacked. A Visigothic army under their king Alaric entered the Eternal City and spent 3 days looting it. Fact 94. It had not happened in 800 years. Since the Gauls had briefly occupied the city in 390 BC, Rome had been inviolable, the sacred, untouchable center of the world. And now the center had been entered and plundered, and the world had not ended, and the sun had risen the following morning exactly as it always had, and that perhaps was the most unsettling thing of all. The world had not ended. Rome was still there. But something had broken, in the imagination of what Rome meant. Let the thought rest softly. Things can be damaged without being destroyed. Changed without being ended. The sack of 410 was not, in practical terms, catastrophic. Alaric and his Visigoths left after 3 days, and Rome continued, battered but intact. But the psychological wound was deep, and the underlying weaknesses that had made it possible did not go away. Over the following decades, the Western Empire contracted further, its territory nibbled away, its emperors increasingly powerless figureheads controlled by Germanic military commanders. In 455 AD, Rome was sacked again, this time by the Vandals, who gave their name to an act of wanton destruction, though the historical reality of what they did was rather more selective and businesslike than the word vandalism suggests. Fact 95. They spent 2 weeks systematically removing treasures accumulated over centuries, gold, silver, artwork, the great 7-branched menorah that the Emperor Titus had brought from Jerusalem almost 400 years earlier, loading it all carefully onto ships and sailing away with it. The harbor is quiet after they leave. The city is diminished, hollowed slightly, like a house after a removal. And then, on the 4th of September in the year 476 AD, the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire, a young man with the almost unbearably poignant name of Romulus Augustulus, little Romulus Augustus, bearing both the name of Rome's founder and its first emperor, was quietly deposed by a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer, who saw no reason to appoint a successor. Fact 96. There was no great battle. No final stand. No dramatic last words recorded for history. Just a young man, removed from a throne that had ceased to mean very much, pensioned off to a comfortable villa in southern Italy, where he presumably lived out his days in relative peace. The Western Roman Empire ended not with a roar but with a quiet administrative decision on an autumn afternoon. The date drifts past softly. 476 AD. The last Western emperor, a boy named after the city's founder. But here is something important, something worth holding on to as the story seems to close. The eastern half of the empire did not fall. Constantinople stood firm. The Eastern Roman Empire, which historians would later call the Byzantine Empire, though its inhabitants always called themselves Romans, continued for nearly another 1,000 years after the fall of the West. Fact 97. It would not finally end until 1453 AD, when Ottoman forces under Sultan Mehmed II took Constantinople after a siege of 53 days. Fact 98. 1,000 years. The empire of Augustus, in its eastern form, outlasted the fall of Rome by longer than the entire span of time between the Norman conquest of England and today. The thought is vast and slow and rather wonderful. Rome, in some form, enduring for more than 2,000 years. And in the West, too, Rome did not simply vanish. It lingered, transformed, in 100 different ways. The Catholic Church preserved Latin as the language of scholarship and worship for more than 1,000 years after the fall, the language of Caesar and Cicero and Virgil becoming the language of prayer and law and learning across medieval Europe. Fact 99. The very word Romania preserves the Roman identity of people who still, 15 centuries later, trace their cultural lineage back to the legions that settled in Dacia. The legal codes of half of Europe still carry the imprint of Rome. The calendar we use, with its months named for Roman gods and emperors, its 7-day week, its leap years, is the Julian calendar, adjusted slightly by Pope Gregory in 1582 but fundamentally the system introduced by Julius Caesar himself. Fact 100. We are there. 100 facts. 100 small windows into a world that lasted for 1,000 years, that stretched from the Atlantic to the Euphrates, that gave us our roads and our laws and our calendar and our alphabet, that produced Marcus Aurelius and Virgil and Epictetus and Cicero, that built things so well that they stand in the Italian sunshine to this day. The Tiber runs on through the dark city. The 7 hills are quiet under the stars. The fountain plays in the empty square, as it has played for a very long time, and the sound of it is cool and clean and endlessly, gently patient. Rome is all around us, still. In the words we use, and the laws we inherit, and the way we organize our months and our days. In the roads that still run straight across the English countryside, and the arches that still stand in the French hills, and the aqueducts that still stride across the Spanish plains on their long stone legs. It did not end. It simply became everything that came after it. And you, here, in the quiet of the night, are part of what came after it too. The city breathes. The stars are still. The Tiber moves on, silver and unhurried, toward the sea. And so we rest here, at the end of our long walk through Rome. We have come a very long way together. From that warm April morning in 753 BC, when a city was founded on 7 hills above a winding river, to the quiet autumn afternoon in 476 when a young man named Romulus set down a crown that no longer meant what it once had. From the she-wolf and the shepherd king, through the centuries of the Republic and the long golden afternoon of the Empire, through the poets and the philosophers, the roads and the aqueducts, the bread and the fish sauce and the thundering chariots, all the way to the slow, patient transformation of Rome into everything the world would become after it. It has been, in every sense, a very long story. And yet it has also been, in its way, a very simple one. A city, built by people who wanted to last. Who paved their roads carefully and made their laws carefully and wrote their thoughts down carefully, as though somewhere in the back of their minds they understood that the words and the stones might outlive everything else. The empire, the glory, the armies, the emperors, all of it temporary. But the idea of Rome, the dream of it, the shape it pressed into the world, that, they somehow knew, would persist. And it has. The fountain is still playing in the square. The water is still cold and clean, falling in the same soft arc it has described for a very long time. The stars above the 7 hills are the same stars that Augustus watched from his garden window, that Marcus Aurelius noted in his journal, that the sentries on the night watch used to find their way. The same stars above you now. There is something quietly extraordinary about that. About the fact that a baker in ancient Rome worried about the price of grain, and a charioteer practiced his turns in the early morning, and a philosopher sat up too late writing things down that he did not intend anyone to read, and that all of it happened, all of it was real, all of it left its mark in ways that reach, still, into the room where you are lying right now. History is not only the grand sweep of empires rising and falling. It is also the small things, the fountain, the lamp, the morning offering at the household shrine, the soldier making camp in a strange land and finding it arranged in the familiar pattern that meant home. The ordinary texture of ordinary days, lived by people who were, underneath everything, not so very different from us. They loved their children. They argued with their neighbors. They got tired at the end of long days and looked forward to sitting down. They looked up at the night sky sometimes and felt small, and sometimes felt, despite everything, that they were part of something larger than themselves. As we are. As we always are. Let Rome settle around you now like a warm and ancient thing. All that stone. All that road. All those words, copied and carried and preserved across the long centuries, from hand to hand and generation to generation, until they reached you here. The Tiber moves on through the dark city, as it has always moved, as it will always move, patient and unhurried and completely indifferent to the question of whether empires rise or fall on its banks, content simply to carry the reflection of the stars on its surface and deliver them, gently, to the sea. The lamp is out now. The city is quiet. The stars are very still. Sleep well.